all-time high, and most notably, jumping up more than 1%, almost 2%, since announcing just within the last few minutes.
Millions of like-new pickup trucks are hitting the market for Pennies, an event so unprecedented that even veterans of the auto industry are calling it a once-in-a-century failure. These aren't worn trade-ins or outdated models. These are nearly new, fully loaded machines being liquidated as fast as transport trucks can unload them. Something deep in the supply chain fractured, and now the entire system is bleeding out. Dealers are drowning in trucks they never asked for. Banks are scrambling to protect collapsing collateral, and owners are waking up to loan balances that make no financial sense. But the real impact, it's still building. So what caused this collapse? Who let it spiral out of control? And what happens when the trucks keep piling up? What's happening? Like new pickup trucks, some barely a year old, were suddenly priced lower than worn sedans. These were clean, dealership-certified trade-ins with perfect service histories and mileage counts that looked like typos. Yet there they were, sitting online and in auction lanes with starting bids so low they felt like pranks. Buyers who assumed it was a glitch refreshed their screens again and again. It did not change. Something had cracked. For decades, full-size pickups were the safest bet in American transportation. They held their value, commanded long wait lists, and acted as reliable financial anchors for families and businesses. But in 2025, that foundation shattered. Trucks once valued at $60,000 or $70,000 were now being dumped for less than a quarter of their former worth. Auctions went silent as longtime bidders stood frozen, unable to process the collapse unfolding in real time. Dealers whispered about emergency liquidation orders. Shipping yards whispered about backlog nightmares. Buyers whispered about the kind of deals people bragged about for years. Every whisper added fuel to a growing suspicion. This was not a sale. This was a rupture. And the moment the public noticed the plunge, the scale of the disaster snapped into focus. But to understand how the prices could break so violently, you must see where the trucks themselves were piling up, the fields of forgotten trucks. Disbelief settled in as drone footage surfaced from the Midwest, showing endless rows of unsold trucks, stretching farther than the camera could track. These were not damaged units or outdated trims. They were spotless, fully loaded models, their paint still glistening with the shine of factory detailing. They sat door to door across acres of makeshift storage, forming metallic mountains that seemed to rise overnight. Workers in transport yards walked between them like ants navigating canyons carved from steel. The scale was breathtaking. Every direction revealed another sea of untouched trucks, each one representing a piece of inventory that should have sold instantly. These were the same trucks that once commanded waiting lists, the same models buyers fought over, the same trims that dealerships used to proudly mark up. Now they collected dust on groundwater-soaked soil while crews burned through overtime hours trying to organize the overflow. Transport managers described it as a steel migration that never ended. Trucks arrived faster than any system could process them. Rail yards overflowed. Secondary lots filled. Then the overflow lots overflowed. Manufacturers had kept production humming long after demand had quietly shifted towards smaller, cheaper, more efficient vehicles. Now, the physical evidence of that miscalculation stood in plain sight. The image of millions of trucks sitting stranded was stunning, but the mystery behind why they existed in such obscene volumes was even more alarming, because the truth behind those overflowing fields started months earlier, in rooms filled with charts, projections, and one colossal mistake. If you want the truth behind this unfolding truck collapse, make sure you like this video and subscribe. And leave a comment so we know how this market shift is hitting where you live. Your insight helps push this warning to more people. The forecast that broke the industry. Confusion erupted inside corporate planning departments when the first warning signs appeared. Their models, long treated as gospel, had insisted demand for trucks would remain strong through 2025. But hidden within those charts were assumptions forged during the pandemic boom years. Assumptions that no longer reflected the rapidly shifting market. Analysts predicted continuous appetite for large pickups, believing Americans would cling to their love for size, power, and towing capability. Instead, rising fuel costs and tighter budgets pushed shoppers towards smaller alternatives faster than anyone anticipated. When the updated data arrived, the forecasts collapsed like broken weather systems predicting blue skies during an approaching storm. Executives stared at graphs that dipped so sharply they looked impossible. The numbers were clear. They had drastically overproduced. Production targets locked in months earlier had created a pipeline too big to shut off in time. The trucks kept coming, even as the buyers disappeared. Internal emails described the situation as a runaway conveyor belt. No matter how quickly sales slowed, the inventory kept flowing in. By the time planners attempted to adjust forecasts, it was already too late. The tide of trucks had become a flood. This forecasting breakdown did not just create excess inventory, it pushed every truck produced afterward toward an inevitable fire sale. And when those trucks hit dealership lots in unstoppable waves, the people on the front lines faced a crisis they could not ignore: the dealership meltdown. That triggered the dumping frenzy. Alarm spread through dealerships the moment the overflow trucks began arriving. Managers watched delivery trucks roll in carrying units they had not requested and could not afford to keep. Every unsold pickup added weight to their floor plan loans, those relentless daily costs dealers pay for each vehicle sitting on their lot. When slow sales turned into stalled sales, those costs became crushing. It felt like standing in a medical triage room with every alarm blaring at once. Dealers slashed prices at a pace no one had ever seen. Trucks that would have held firm above $50,000 dropped to the 30s, then the 20s, then lower still. Some stores held dawn-hour liquidation events. Others quietly shipped perfectly good trucks to auctions, knowing the bids would be brutal, but needing every dollar they could claw back. Sales staff were told to move anything with wheels, regardless of profit. The panic created a self-feeding cycle. More trucks dumped meant more prices falling. More falling prices meant more panic. Buyers walked onto lots and found deals so absurd they questioned whether the vehicles were stolen. But the truth was far simpler. Dealerships were in survival mode, fighting to keep lenders from calling in their loans. The dumping frenzy did not start with consumers. It started with the people who could no longer hold the line. And the chaos unleashed in dealership lots was only the opening of a collapse that would reshape the entire automotive landscape. Banks confront collateral that's dying fast. Concerns spread through banking offices the moment the first truck values collapsed. What had once been dependable collateral suddenly looked like fruit rotting from the inside, losing integrity long before anyone noticed the surface softening. Banks rely on predictable residual values to secure loans and calculate risk. But when those nearly new pickups plunged in resale price overnight, the numbers on their spreadsheets became warnings rather than estimates. Loan-to-value assumptions that had held steady for more than a decade no longer matched reality, and the gap between expectation and truth widened with every truck sent to auction. Executives reviewed portfolios and saw assets deteriorating faster than amortization schedules could keep up. Trucks financed at pandemic-inflated prices no longer covered their own debt, leaving lenders exposed to losses they had not planned for. Internal meetings shifted from measured discussions to urgent huddles about how to protect balance sheets. Some banks quietly raised interest rates on new auto loans. Others froze certain categories of lending entirely, hoping to limit the damage before it spread further. The collapse of collateral value was the hidden domino, falling silently but pushing the next pieces toward the edge. And as lenders tightened their grip, they inadvertently made life harder for the very people struggling the most. Because while banks wrestled with deteriorating assets, individual owners were sinking into something far more personal and far more painful. Owners sink into the negative equity pit. Frustration became the defining emotion for thousands of truck owners who suddenly realized their prized machines were worth far less than the sum printed on their loan documents. Many had purchased during the feverish years when prices soared and availability was scarce, believing they were securing a dependable asset. Instead, inflated pandemic-era costs had lured them into commitments that now felt like stepping into quicksand. Every payment pulled them deeper, yet the principal barely budged because the truck's value had fallen so sharply. Owners checked online pricing tools and felt their stomachs drop when they saw valuations thousands below what they still owed. Attempts to trade in vehicles were met with sympathetic nods from dealership staff who could offer little more than disappointment. Selling privately was no escape either. Buyers demanded bargain prices, knowing the market had turned, and many owners could not afford to absorb the difference. Some tried refinancing, only to be rejected by lenders unwilling to touch collapsing collateral. Others considered voluntary surrender, but the resulting credit damage felt like another trap. The emotional toll grew heavier each month. For many families, the truck had been a symbol of mobility, work, and confidence. Now it represented debt, regret, and the fear of financial instability. And while personal budgets buckled under the strain, another group was making decisions that would send new shockwaves back up the supply chain. Because as individual owners struggled to stay afloat, fleet managers saw the danger ahead and acted immediately. Fleet managers pull the plug on future orders. Apprehension guided the decisions of fleet managers who monitored costs with meticulous precision. When truck values began slipping and auction results turned grim, they recognized the threat faster than almost anyone else. Fleets operate on tight cost models, balancing depreciation, fuel, maintenance, and replacement cycles with mathematical discipline. The moment those calculations no longer added up, it felt like supply arteries freezing mid-flow. Managers who had planned to refresh entire segments of their fleets abruptly froze, all pending orders. Large service companies, construction groups, and regional delivery networks issued immediate directives to halt procurement. Some fleets extended the life of older units, choosing repairs over replacements. Others redeployed lightly used vehicles to cover routes instead of buying new ones. Manufacturers who had counted on predictable bulk orders suddenly saw their most stable clients disappear. Sales teams scrambled to reassure commercial buyers, but the spreadsheets told a story no one could argue with. Depreciation, volatility made forecasting impossible, and no fleet manager wanted to risk purchasing assets that could lose thousands in value within weeks. The shock to manufacturers was immediate and severe. Fleet orders often anchor production schedules, smoothing demand during seasonal lulls. Without those anchors, entire production plans wobbled. And while large companies could adapt quickly, rural communities already navigating fragile economies felt the fallout in ways far more personal. Because as commercial orders evaporated, the first true economic pain landed in towns built around the heartbeat of truck-driven commerce. Rural economies absorbed the first real blow. Dread settled over rural communities as the collapse rippled far beyond dealership lots. In small towns where trucks were not merely vehicles, but essential tools, the shift hit with the force of a bruise spreading beneath the skin. Local economies built on agriculture, small construction outfits, and independent trades relied heavily on steady truck turnover. When purchases slowed and values dropped, the businesses supporting those trucks began to struggle. Mechanic shops reported fewer service appointments as owners delayed repairs. Parts suppliers trimmed hours. Tire retailers watched inventory sit longer than usual. Tax bases, already narrow, tightened further as sales decreased. Town budgets that depended on vehicle-related revenue faced uncomfortable cuts. Economic activity that once circulated briskly now moved sluggishly, touching fewer hands and supporting fewer workers. For many residents, the truck market had been a quiet but crucial economic engine, and its downturn signaled a larger weakening they could feel, but not fully articulate. Small supply stores, hauling services, and agricultural cooperatives all noticed thinning demand. Even local lenders grew cautious, tightening approvals for equipment and vehicle loans. Jobs that had once felt secure yard technicians, delivery drivers, regional mechanics became uncertain almost overnight. And as the slowdown deepened, communities realized they were confronting more than a temporary dip, because the shockwaves radiating through rural America were only the beginning of a broader economic transformation waiting. Automakers cut the cord on their own truck lines. Betrayal was the emotion many auto workers felt when the announcements began rolling in. Factories that had thundered with the rhythms of truck production for decades suddenly went quiet as corporate leaders admitted what workers feared. The numbers no longer worked. Truck-heavy portfolios that once generated dependable profit had turned into liabilities, and automakers responded by cutting the cord as abruptly as a parent abandoning its children. Production lines were paused mid-cycle, retooling crews were summoned with little notice, and workers who expected long careers found themselves staring at closure notices pinned to breakroom walls. The shift was not gradual. Corporate executives delivered the news with the urgency of people trying to outrun a financial slide. Plants specializing in full-size trucks were ordered to prepare for transformation into facilities focused on compact, efficient models. For many employees, this pivot felt like betrayal not only of labor, but of tradition. Generations of families had built their lives around these plants, believing the demand for trucks was unshakable. Instead, they watched their legacy rearranged almost overnight. Some workers were transferred across states. Others were offered buyouts or temporary furloughs. Morale sank as assembly lines grew still and the familiar roar of production faded. The fracture left behind was emotional as much as economic, and it spread far beyond the factory floors into boardrooms where the next steps were already forming. Because as manufacturers scrambled to reinvent themselves, lawmakers were preparing to redirect the future with even greater force. If you want to stay ahead of the next moves in this market, subscribe now. These shifts are happening fast, and the people who understand them first will be the ones prepared. Stay informed, stay ready, and don't miss what breaks next. Lawmakers redirect the future without warning. Urgency swept through political offices as lawmakers confronted the scale of the truck market's unraveling. With sales plunging and oversupply rising, policymakers saw an opening to push aggressive shifts in transportation strategy. They began redirecting the flow of automotive priorities as decisively as engineers redirect rivers, announcing regulatory incentives that favored compact, fuel-efficient vehicles while tightening standards around large trucks. For years, debates over emissions and efficiency had simmered, but now the market collapse provided the political momentum to act. Legislators rolled out proposals that accelerated the decline of large pickups, offering tax benefits for smaller vehicle platforms and tightening compliance rules for truck manufacturers. Some states introduced rebate structures that made downsizing appealing for families. Others mandated future emissions targets that would be nearly impossible for heavy trucks to meet without expensive redesigns. The combination of incentives and restrictions sent a shock through the automotive sector, reshaping plans that companies thought were stable. Policymakers justified the sudden pressure as a necessary correction for an industry drifting toward unsustainable trends. Critics argued the shift was too abrupt, risking job loss and supply chain instability. But supporters saw it as an essential leap toward modernized mobility. Either way, the direction was set, and companies had no choice but to adapt. And while legislators reshaped the policy landscape, another powerful group was quietly turning its attention elsewhere. Because as political forces rewired the regulatory map, investors began choosing their own battleground. The investment world turns against the pickup. Conflict erupted in financial circles as investors reassessed the foundations of companies heavily tied to pickup trucks. What had long been considered a safe sector suddenly looked volatile, prompting funds to rotate out of truck-dependent stocks with strategic precision. Within trading floors and digital brokerages, analysts spoke of shifting alliances as if discussing battle plans. The drop in residual values, the decline in fleet orders, and the growing regulatory pressure signaled risk, and investors reacted as if stepping onto a battlefield where loyalties changed by the hour. Portfolios were rebalanced with sweeping speed. Some institutional investors reallocated capital toward manufacturers specializing in hybrids and compact models. Others directed funds into sectors adjacent to new mobility technologies, seeking stability in infrastructure, software, and energy storage. Truck-heavy corporations watched their market capitalization wobble as sell-offs accelerated. Commentators described the movement as a coordinated retreat, not driven by panic, but by strategic repositioning. The sudden change created its own vibrations. Companies that once dominated headlines with strong quarterly performance found themselves fielding questions about long-term relevance. Shareholder meetings turned tense as executives presented updated transition plans designed to reassure jittery investors. But the pressure kept building, and global markets took notice. Because while Wall Street clashed over the future of trucks, foreign buyers made decisions that further reshaped the industry's trajectory. Overseas buyers reject America's steel beasts. Unease settled across the export sector as overseas buyers began stepping back from American trucks. Long valued for their power and durability, these vehicles now felt out of sync with international markets increasingly focused on compact, high-efficiency transportation. Trade brokers described deals slipping away like cargo drifting from closed ports. Buyers who once purchased large batches of trucks for commercial fleets or resale networks now asked for smaller, lighter models with lower operating costs and less regulatory burden. Importers in Europe, Asia, and parts of South America cited rising fuel prices, city congestion rules, and cultural shifts toward environmental responsibility as reasons for reducing truck orders. Even regions traditionally drawn to American pickups expressed hesitation. Transport companies demanded vehicles easier to maintain in dense urban environments. Retail buyers sought models that mirrored global mobility trends rather than American preferences. Export contracts that manufacturers once counted on quietly dissolved. Some brokers attempted renegotiations, but the appetite had changed too dramatically. Factories built around international sales faced difficult adjustments as production lines dedicated to export configurations slowed. The global demand that once supported the American truck industry no longer aligned with its offerings. The export retreat marked another structural shift, reinforcing that the collapse was not confined to domestic pressure, but echoed worldwide. The consequences extended far beyond lost sales and hinted at a permanent transformation in global automotive priorities. And as international markets closed their doors, the full magnitude of the truck collapse revealed a new and unsettling global reality. Insurers rewrite risk after the truck fallout. Anxiety rippled through the insurance industry as companies reassessed risk models that had remained stable for decades. The collapse in truck values, combined with shifting claims patterns and unpredictable reliability indicators, forced underwriters to sharpen their pencils, with the focus of actuaries sharpening knives. Trucks that had once been considered durable and cost-efficient now appeared volatile in actuarial tables, creating a recalibration that changed everything overnight. Insurers began raising premiums for certain models, citing higher repair costs, parts shortages, and depreciation volatility as justification. Owners were stunned to see annual rates jump even as their vehicle values plummeted. Insurance executives argued that premiums reflected true market conditions rather than sentimental attachments, but the impact was immediate and painful. Policies that once felt routine became expensive commitments, and some households found themselves priced out of coverage entirely. In response, insurers introduced tiered structures that rewarded smaller, more efficient vehicles with lower rates, reinforcing a shift already underway in consumer behavior. The restructuring signaled a deeper transformation. Trucks were no longer viewed as dependable mainstream assets, but as higher-risk bets in an evolving landscape. And while insurance firms adjusted their models, truck owners faced an entirely different reckoning, one tied to the fading cultural meaning of the machines they had long cherished. Because as premiums climbed and risk tables shifted, the emotional foundation supporting truck culture began to crack as well. The identity crisis of the American pickup driver. Introspection settled over truck culture Americans as they confronted a shift few thought possible. For generations, the pickup had been more than transportation. It was a symbol of self-reliance, strength, and tradition. But as market collapse stripped away resale confidence and rising costs undermined practicality, a cultural mirror cracked in slow motion. Drivers who once saw their trucks as extensions of personal identity now wrestled with a new emotional landscape. The collapse of the pickup as a cultural symbol left many feeling unmoored, torn between long-held pride and the economic realities pressing against them. Some continued driving their trucks out of loyalty, even as maintenance, fuel, and insurance costs climbed. Others reluctantly downsized, feeling a sense of loss that went beyond simple preference. Conversations at diners, job sites, and local meetups shifted from horsepower and towing capacity to affordability and uncertainty. What had been a lifestyle now felt like a disappearing era. This shift was not merely about vehicles, it reflected a deeper change in how people understood themselves within their communities. As the identity struggled to adapt, cities and suburbs long shaped by the dominance of large vehicles began recalibrating their physical environments with a practical eye. Because as cultural meaning faded, urban and suburban planners faced their own undeniable truth. Space itself had to evolve. The new reality for cities and suburbs. Realism defined the thinking of city planners who found themselves reassessing infrastructure shaped by decades of truck dominance. With more households shifting toward compact vehicles, the spatial assumptions of parking lots, road widths, and zoning regulations no longer aligned with emerging habits. The once familiar layout of urban and suburban landscapes now resembled a chessboard being rearranged, every square reconsidered for efficiency. Municipal leaders began proposing smaller parking spaces, narrower lanes, and updated building codes that reflected a world where oversized vehicles played a reduced role. Cities and suburbs adapted at different speeds, with dense areas reclaiming space for pedestrians and transit, while suburbs slowly reshaped parking and neighborhoods for smaller vehicles. Planners realized growth required maximizing land, not preserving truck footprints. As redesigns advanced, one question persisted: if trucks were fading, what would replace them, and what future would that choice create for us all? Because behind every policy shift and redesign was a larger unanswered mystery about the next fate of mobility. The unanswered question. Unresolved tension hung over the future of transportation as consumers, manufacturers, and analysts tried to envision what might replace the role trucks once played. Systemic realignment had rewritten assumptions about mobility, but no clear successor emerged to claim the territory trucks were vacating. Some believed compact utility vehicles would fill the gap. Others argued that electric platforms, modular designs, or multifunctional vans would eventually rise to dominance. Yet none carried the cultural weight, versatility, and identity that trucks once provided. Manufacturers tested new designs, while startups offered futuristic concepts, yet none delivered a clear successor. The market felt like an open field where yesterday's giants had vanished, leaving consumers uncertain. Innovation had space to grow, but no promises. For the first time in generations, mobility's future was unwritten, and in the quiet of collapse, the next move belonged to us. The truck market collapse is only beginning, and what comes next could reshape everything from pricing to ownership to the future of American vehicles. If this breakdown is hitting your area, share what you're seeing in the comments. Your insight helps others stay ahead of the shift. And if you want to track every twist in this unfolding story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications.